Hi, and welcome to
Specification. If you want to read it, then just stop here and have a quick
natural
flick through.
selection.
Remember,
Applications are the things that you need to know and could be, well, obviously you need to know all of it, but the applications may also be assessed in exam questions. Okay, so it should be a relatively quick one. There's only 2 slides to this. So we start with just a description of natural selection. Now what I've done here is I have highlighted in pink the keywords. So usually to describe natural selection, you might get 3 or 4 marks in an exams question. So natural selection is the survival of the fittest or the most fit or the best adapted to the environment. Now you have to say that there's variation within a population. You often also get a mark for talking about the fact that mutations cause variation, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So you can say variation within a population due to mutation would get you 2 marks. You have to link the fact that the best adapted to the environment survive because they're the most fit to the environment and they go on to reproduce. So basically, if a species is surviving, you have to assume that it's going to reproduce and produce offspring. The offspring then inherit the alleles for the advantageous traits. So you have to say alleles rather than genes. And this little diagram here just kind of shows you how that works. Okay, so causes of variation. This might come up as they might ask you about these separately, or they might ask you about them in a longer extended response question. So mutation can cause advantageous traits within a species. Obviously, those individuals are then more likely to survive. Meiosis produces variation because all gametes produced are different. I should say different, not difference. Therefore, no 2 offspring would be the same, apart from if they were identical twins. And sexual reproduction also causes variation because the males and females of a species come together randomly to produce their offspring. There's nothing that suggests who's going to reproduce with who. Also remember that an adaptation occurs within a population, not to an individual. So if you just kind of dumped me in the middle of the Antarctic, I wouldn't all of a sudden grow a fur coat to keep me warm. It happens over a long period of time within a population rather than to an individual. And then finally, overproduction of offspring. This means that some species produce more offspring than the environment can actually sustain. So they know that the majority of the offspring won't make it. It means that the individuals with the most advantageous traits or the strongest individuals survive, and the other ones die before they reach maturity. However, be aware that sometimes survival is just due to chance. There's always an anomaly to every rule in science. Okay, examples of natural selection. We've got Galapagos finches, which you may have looked at before. So when Charles Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands, he collected specimens from each island and he studied them. He collected specimens of finches from different islands in the Galapagos. He studied them, and also other scientists have studied them as well, and they found that they all had slightly different beaks. And the reason that they had slightly different beaks is because on each island the food sources are slightly different, so there's different seeds that different finches eat on different islands. And the reason that's an example of natural selection is because over time the finches on each island, the ones, for example, if they only had access to big seeds, then the finches with the bigger beaks would be able to survive, and they would pass on the allele for bigger beaks to their offspring, and so on and so on. And then there's other examples of natural selection that's taken place on the Galapagos Islands since then, due to a change in the food source or the availability of the food that specific finches eat. We've also got some stuff about antibiotic resistance here. This is actually a really nice visual example of antibiotic resistance if you want to pause and have a look at that. You need to know that some bacteria are resistant to antibiotics. Now, please don't get confused. You can't talk about immunity and antibiotics. You can only talk about bacteria being resistant. People cannot be resistant to antibiotics. It's not a thing. So some bacteria might be resistant to specific antibiotics. And this occurs because a mutation happens within the plasmids and causes resistance. So it might be a mutation that produces a protein that is able to break down the antibiotic. And then when a person's infected with a bacterium, if they take antibiotics and their infection is a resistant infection, then obviously the antibiotics won't kill it, and it's up to the person's immune system to kill it. If the immune system isn't strong enough, then this could result in death. Or if the person is immunocompromised or already sick with something, then they might die from a bacterial infection that they previously wouldn't have died from. It's also worth knowing as well that bacteria can transfer plasmids from between each other. So the mutation doesn't have to occur in each bacterium for them to become resistant. It only needs to occur in one, and then that one bacterium can make lots of plasmids with the resistant gene, the resistant allele, and pass it on to lots of other bacteria. So then they all become resistant, as opposed to just one being resistant. And that's it for 5.2.